Bible passage for today is Hebrews 11:23 through 29. By faith, Moses' parents hid him for 3 months after he was born, because they saw that he was no ordinary child, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than to enjoy in the fleeting pleasures of sin. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt, because he was looking ahead to his reward. By faith, he left Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. He persevered because he saw him who is invisible. By faith, he kept the Passover and the application of blood, so that the destroyer of the firstborn would not touch the firstborn of Israel. By faith, the people passed through the Red Sea as on dry land, but when the Egyptians tried to do so, they were drowned.
Thank you, Joyce. Considering this morning the faith of Moses as we work through this sermon series on Hebrews chapter 11. Now, as the writer of the book of Hebrews goes dashing through the Old Testament, he's taken quite a leap. If you remember from last Sunday, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph each got 1/3 of a sermon. From Joseph to Moses is a gap of about 300 years. And during that 300 years, the Hebrew people have grown in numbers, and they grew so large that they came to be seen as a threat to Egypt. And instead of asking them to leave, the choice was made to enslave them, with all of the hardship that would bring. But as we know from Scripture, in God's time, He would deliver them from Egypt, and He would do so by bringing onto the world stage quite an unusual man. A man who would not only lead the Exodus, but who would be the conduit between the people and God as God gave His covenant. In sharing God's revelation with the world, Moses would help the world make a huge leap in their understanding of who God is. Now, just historically, Moses is one of the greatest and most impacting men who has ever lived. Moses, more than any other man, separated the natural world from the spiritual world. Now, as soon as I say that, that might bring a little bit of confusion, because sometimes we get a little upset with the fact that people live in this world as if it's unconnected from the spiritual world, and that's a bad thing. But as bad as being unconnected can be, if you're too connected, like Moses' world was, that's a problem as well. What do you mean by that, Pastor? Is it wrong to be connected to God? No, not at all. But in Moses' day, the religions of the world were all about manipulating gods, and you manipulated the gods by doing earthly sorts of things. You worship them in certain ways to get the gods to do what you wanted them to do. That was the way that you dealt with a god. You did something physical, and the god would see and respond. So, at that time, fertility cults abounded, idols proliferated. So when Moses came to the world and shared with us God's standard that you shall make no graven images, he was pointing the world in a new direction altogether. Unlike anything that the world knew at that time, except for that little Hebrew group who was beginning to, or at least was holding on to at least some portions of their original faith. But Moses, for the rest of the world, showed that God is separate from the world as such, and he cannot be manipulated. And nothing physical can be made that will come anywhere close to his likeness. In fact, to make something physical to worship is to head entirely in the opposite direction of truth. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and in truth. Moses revolutionized the world. So let's consider this morning the faith of Moses. Well, the first thing that we notice about Moses is that he had faithful beginnings. Now, Moses' faith did not begin with him, and the writer of Hebrews includes the note of approval for faithful parents. His parents, Amram and Jochebed. Beautiful names. There may be an Amram running around, but I don't think there's been a Jochebed in a long time. They were of the tribe or the family of Levi. Now, we didn't get to choose the times in which we were born, and neither did Amram and Jochebed. And this couple lived in the darkest of times for their people. It was a time, again, as I mentioned, of slavery. Not only that, but they lived at a time when all of the male children of the Hebrews, by command of the Pharaoh, were to be thrown into the Nile River to be eaten by crocodiles. Usually the announcement of "it's a boy" is greeted with family approval. Not so much in the home of Amram and Jochebed when they heard the same announcement. A girl could survive. And that's kind of unusual because if you look through the history of the world, male children tend to be a bit more protected than female children. But in this instance, in this one little blip in time, the Hebrew children, or the Hebrew girls, were the more protected group. The writer of Hebrews tells us that by faith, Moses' parents hid him for 3 months after he was born because they saw he was not an ordinary child and they were not afraid of the king's edict. Now, there is much that we don't know about this situation. The Bible tells us some things, but it hides certain other things. What marked Moses as an extraordinary child? We don't know the answer to that. Did his parents have a vision from God to tell them that God had a special plan to use this child? Or was it just the natural God-given parental love that spurred them to ignore the king's edict? We're not sure. I know this, that every one of my children, as soon as I saw them, I could tell they were really special and clearly a cut above. You probably felt the same way with yours. The book of Hebrews doesn't really give us any extra insight. Hebrews and Hebrews 11 is really great at making these big statements and just hanging them out there. But what we do know is this, that it was the right thing for Moses' parents to ignore what the king commanded, and so they did. They were also of the faithful line of Abraham, who believed that life did not end in Egypt, and it was not going to end in Egypt for the Hebrew people. And for their son, they hoped for better things than an end in the jaws of a crocodile. Somehow, they were holding to the fact that God would keep his promise to rescue. They knew it was God's ultimate promise to rescue the nation. Well, let's cooperate in that direction, and maybe in our time, God might save our son. Because the writer of Hebrews skips through Moses' life really quickly, I'm going to follow the writer of Hebrews, but it's just an incredible story of faith in God's providence, the way that Moses was saved and the way that he grew. But the writer does tell us that Amram and Jochebed were not afraid of the king's edict. Now, it doesn't mean that there was nothing to fear. This is a way of saying they chose to do something else for a better reason. They could have been put to death for this disobedience, but instead they feared doing the wrong thing before God more than they feared the consequences that came from Pharaoh. And that principle carries over to the New Testament, where Jesus tells us, do not be afraid of those who kill the body, but cannot kill the soul. Rather, be afraid of the one who can destroy both soul and body in hell. Simply put, and this is a wonderful principle of life, do the God-honoring thing in every situation. You know, the scripture tells us that there is a way that seems right to a man. There's a way that seems right to a woman. There's a way that seems right. When you're in trouble, when you're trying to figure it out, when difficulty has arisen, there's a way that you can work it out. And it's amazing how many times the way that seems the best and easiest way to go violates some command of God. You know, I'm not a tax cheat, but I'm going to cheat on them this year because I'm in trouble. And you can't, well, yeah, you can believe all of the things in life that the temptation comes to you. If you will cut the corner here, and we get out of this situation, then, boy, I'm going to live for God, and it's going to be the straight and narrow the rest of the way. I will just tell you this. I have found through my life and experience, God will make it difficult. It will be difficult to do the right thing. It'll be difficult. And you can think in your life right now, oh, I'm doing the wrong thing. I'm doing the wrong thing because doing the right thing is just hard. We talk about faith, and Hebrews 11 is about faith. And sometimes in church we think about faith as it becomes, we start thinking of like the really, really spiritual people of the church. Wow, these people have camel knees because they pray so much. These are people of great faith. And it's amazing how many times in Scripture, faith is just trusting God enough to do the right thing. You know, there's that great little scripture verse where the one who is approved is the person who swears to his own hurt and changes not. You entered a business deal, you gave your word, and then it started to go south, and it's going to cost you money to keep your word. So if I could just find a way to get out of this, I will. Who's the person of faith? The person who keeps their word. So I just want to tell you right here, and you know, it would be great if this advice to you would also make it easy, but it doesn't. God has designed, as God works with us, as He develops us morally, He has decided to make it hard. Let me just tell you, obey God in every situation. Every shortcut you take will come back to bite you. It will never work out as you imagine. Trust God. Trust God. I remember a man I was talking to, and it was a pretty complicated legal situation. And he was in front of me and said, but if I do this, I might go to jail. And I said, and I'll visit you. Now, you want to stay out of all those things where you might go to jail in the first place. But as he's working through this, you at some point, you got to start doing right. And the Bible is pretty clear that today is the day of salvation because tomorrow isn't promised, and you don't want to be overtaken not doing what is right. So do what is right in every situation. Do not cut a corner. This is always a test of your faith. Will you believe God enough that He will work things out in His way if I do not cut this corner? I will tell you this, God will honor you if you walk right down the center of that straight and narrow way. Do not cut the corners. Do the God-honoring situation, or honoring thing in every situation. Don't fear so much, even for your physical life, that you fail to honor God. The faith of Moses was encouraged because of the faith of his parents, who put their lives on the line to protect him. So faithful beginnings, and then you see in Moses' life faithful choices. Look, honestly, Moses merits many sermons. A lot of them would come from verses 24 to 28 of our reading. But Moses in this series just gets one sermon. I want to just point out a few of the remarkable choices that Moses made. First, he refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He refused to walk like an Egyptian. Okay, there's a couple of you that got that. You can tell we're getting old. Let me tell you what, worse than dad jokes are pastor's jokes. If you didn't get it, okay, there was like a girl group in the 80s called the Bangles, and they had a song, Walk Like an Egyptian. Okay, never mind. Note to self, as you're getting older, don't tell those jokes anymore. All right. So, he refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. Now, I'll just have to tell you, to be transferred from a Hebrew slave family to the royal Egyptian family was almost an infinite improvement. But Moses ultimately said no to that. Yes, he was raised there, but he turned from being an Egyptian to casting his lot, his identity, with that of the other Hebrew slaves. Now, at that moment, it seemed foolish to everyone. It probably seemed foolish even to the Hebrews. What, you were out? Are you kidding me? You had your ticket was punched. You're in great shape. But they couldn't see the future. And they weren't listening to a divine call that transcended the circumstances of their lives. One of the ways that Satan tempts us is with more and better. And once we get the mindset that more money, higher position, and following every success that our talent can bring us is always the way of God, we are set up for failure. I hope in your lifetime you have the opportunity to say no to more and better, because it's not right. I'm not saying it's always wrong. More and better can be a wonderful blessing, but more and better is not always right. I remember having a conversation with a pastor, and it made my blood run cold. And he's a guy that had moved from church to church to church, and we were talking about that. And I was trying to figure that out. How does that happen? You know, God just wants to land you at a place for 2 years, and then you're out. And he looked at me and he says, people kept offering me more money to go somewhere else. And he says, I just believe that if the church offers me more money, that's God's will. Ooh. That's a frightening place to be. I hope you don't think in your life that just because you get offered more money or something better, that is a sign of God's will. I'm not saying, again, that the more money for another job might not be in God's will for you, but you must be careful. You must be careful, because sometimes great difficulty comes with the promise of more and better. I will say this. I do believe that Satan is pretty happy to give all of us enough success to send us to hell. It's not just Jesus who faced such temptations. We face them as well. We are offered sometimes the kingdoms of the world, power, wealth, and if we're not careful and we don't watch out, success will kill us. I think this morning, and I'm not even going to name any names, but I know a couple of pop stars who began their lives in pastors' homes. And they start singing in church, and one success leads to another, and they never find a way to say no. I think they want to say no at some point, but they don't. So you kind of cut the Christian message, and you dress to be a little edgier, and you wear a little less, and your language becomes a little more salty because really only prudes will care about that. And then you find yourself so far away from God that turning around and doing something different would be like turning around to Queen Mary. So much effort. There's so much to say goodbye to. So I just want to say to us all, I don't think any of us are burgeoning pop stars, but it happens to a different degree. It can happen to a different degree for every person. Be careful of the compromises you must make for success, because they lead you astray. And Moses, again, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He took his stand with God's people. Secondly, this is a corollary of the first, he chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a short time. He regarded the disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt, because he was looking ahead to his reward. Wow. Moses, how dumb are you? Look what you gave up. Look what you gave up. And he would be dumb if we lived in nothing but a material world where God's will for our lives does not matter. But throughout the Bible, God calls his people to himself. He calls us to himself. And he lets us know that in every generation, the move towards him will always be upstream. It will be against the tide of popular opinion. Moses gave up Egypt for God. I never think about this sort of sacrifice without thinking of a true story from our time. Nikolai and Elena Ceausescu. Nikolai was the dictator of Romania. And they were being held for trial. And it was dangerous for them. And eventually, after the trial, they were put to death. But there were quite a few months before the trial. And they were hidden away in the home of a Christian pastor who volunteered to take care of them. That pastor had suffered deprivation under their hand, and that pastor had some older children. Each of them were quite intelligent. At least two of them had wanted to have a medical career, but they were denied that education because of their Christian faith. And so, instead of going on into medicine, they each became common laborers, working really hard lives because they chose to be mistreated with the people of God rather than take an easier way out. How heartbreaking must it have been for that pastor to see his children so mistreated, denied opportunities that should have been theirs, but denied opportunities because of their faith. And how incredible a testimony that he would show the Ceausescu's kindness in their last days. I will tell you this, there are heroes in this world that no one ever hears about, but they are celebrated in heaven. People who choose to side with God, even though it costs them. The writer of Hebrews also makes the connection for us that in doing the right things, Moses did it for the sake of Christ. That's called an anachronism, by the way. Whenever you attribute someone in the past to their belief for something in the future that they could not have fully known. But in this case, it's not truly an anachronism, because people will raise, well, that's an anachronism, as if you're making an argument that doesn't follow. But in this case, it does follow. The writer of Hebrews is saying, in following God and in doing the right thing, Moses was actually serving Christ. The Messiah that Moses was serving came about 4,000 years after Moses lived. And I will just say that if Moses could be on Christ's side 4,000 years before he arrived, don't talk to me about how the church has old-fashioned standards of morality. God is one and God is eternal. Get on his side no matter when you live, because God is not changing. Third, just like his parents, he did not fear the king's anger. He feared God more than Pharaoh. So he willingly led the Exodus because we are told he persevered because he saw him who is invisible. Another impossibility. How do you see something that's invisible? Moses saw God. So I want to ask you, do you see God? Do you see God? Is God more real than friends, government, anything else? One of the great themes of Scripture is that what is real and solid lasts for eternity, but what seems to be solid in the eyes of the world is slipping away and becoming more unreal all the time. So we're encouraged to build our lives on sure foundations and not sinking sands. And we need to be reminded that the sure foundation is the invisible one, but more real than any foundation that you can see. Fourth, Moses obeyed God in the matter of the sprinkling of the blood over the doorposts of the Hebrews, so that when God sent his angel of death throughout Egypt, the firstborn Egyptian sons were all killed, yet the Hebrew sons were saved. I hope you can see God's fearful symmetry at work there. Because Moses, remember, was the son of a Hebrew who by Pharaoh's decree was to be killed. And now the Egyptians lose their firstborn sons, the one most precious to them. If you ever believe that God is not keeping score and God is losing things, as you know, there's so many events happening, he never misses. And certainly the firstborn children of Israel were saved, but in God's providence it was also the saving of the Messiah. In Hosea 11:1 we read, "When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son." Now there's a bit of double meaning to that text. Yes, Joseph and Mary escaped to Egypt with the baby Jesus, and then they returned. So there is that one interpretation, and it's right that Jesus was called out of Egypt. But it's also true that the text refers to Israel, which was Jacob's name, and his was the family that was enslaved in Egypt. But the Exodus had to occur so that God could get his people out of Egypt and into the promised land, because there was a Messiah to be born, and the Messiah had to be born in the promised land. And Moses, by faith, helped to make it happen. What an impactful life. And then Moses offered faithful leadership. Verse 29 is a classic biblical understatement. Yes, the people did pass through the Red Sea, and the Egyptians were drowned in it, and they did it by faith. But for that group to have faith, they needed a lot of prep work. Leadership is hard, and I doubt that anyone understands it completely. And I sometimes have serious doubts about people who hold seminars on leadership, because I've found that it's easier to give a talk on leadership than it is to exercise godly leadership. But in Moses, God used a faithful man to show his power, and he showed it in him, and he showed it through him. And throughout the plagues, and then up to the moment of the crossing of the Red Sea, the people had someone to look to. We're looking at someone who sees beyond our circumstances. Someone who told them that it would be worth it, that God would deliver them. Moses was a gift to his people, and looking at him, they had faith to participate in the impossible. The world has never seen anything like the Exodus. I have people in my life who I look to for encouragement. No, I don't idolize people, and I know that everyone is imperfect. But I have heroes who I watch, and I'm encouraged by their perseverance. Ultimately, I look to Jesus. But it is nice to see people who are a little further down life's road who tells me that it really is worth it to serve Jesus. And sometimes I see them not just ahead of me, but I see them right around me. And just as Moses' faith helped the faith of the nation to spring to life, so we are called to show faith in order that others might believe. Someone may see you and say, "Your steadfastness in trouble helped me to be strong." What a privilege it will be to one day see Jesus. and to see those who influenced us to be better, and to see those who we've influenced to be better. To hold on a little longer and to finish well. The call before us this morning is to see him who is invisible, not one who can be portrayed by an idol, but the one who made us and who entered the world in the form of a man. And he still dwells among us. And we meet him in many places, and we meet him in many ways. We meet him in the scriptures. We meet him in prayer. But certainly we meet him in the communion of his church, to which he invites us. Don't kid yourself about ultimate things. Yes, they put the blood over the doorposts, the blood of lambs over the doorposts, so that the Hebrew children would be saved. But ultimately, it's Christ's blood on the doorposts of Egypt. That's the salvation of the Hebrew firstborn. And it's his blood upon our hearts that cleanses us from sin. Before the throne my surety stands. 5 bleeding wounds he bears. Forgive him. Oh, forgive, they cry.